thank you everyone. Thanks for having me. So the first talk was more about, I suppose, the sort of creativity and intelligence. I'm leaning towards the fantasy more because that's the area I work on. So, quick question, I suppose, to begin with. Have you ever heard of the term paracosm? Paracosms. Paracosms are those worlds that children create, usually around toys, and often in collaboration with other children. You will, of course, know the adult works of writers such as the Bronte sisters, but have you ever heard of their childhood creations, for example? So the worlds of Gondel and Angria, complete with maps, a cosmogonical framework, interweaved stories and literary traditions. So these stories were acted out through a set of toy soldiers that belonged to the only brother of the group, Branwell, and was supported by the siblings' own minuscule manuscripts and other writing. So you have some of the pictures there towards the right. If you've heard of the young Bronte story creations, it's quite possible you might also have heard about Boxen, which is a world of talking animals fashioned by a very young C.S. Lewis and his brother Warney, a world of, based on a box of toy animals. Again, so toys are at the center of this. And the Boxen stories were again elaborated via adventures and maps and timelines and other paraphernalia. So some of those have survived in the pictures on that side. So as it's obvious, at least some members of both of these sets of siblings went on to become celebrated writers, and especially well recognized for their imaginative creations. Now, paracosms are within the normal range of childhood experience. I mean, if I take, shall we take a quick show of hands? How many of you created worlds like that with toys or based on TV things or sort of comics as children? I did, yeah? There you go. So this is completely part of a developmental stage for many, many people. And in many ways, writing fiction is very much a continuation of such activities. As Umberto Eco wisely said, writing a novel is a cosmological matter. To tell a story, you must first of all construct a world. So all fiction creates worlds, but some worlds are seemingly closer to ours, while some are other, alternative, imaginary, either in a subtle way or in a much more self-conscious way. Now, all of this has become an object of study recently. Mark Wolf has examined the activity of building imaginary worlds as a topic worthy of study in its own right, independent of any accompanying narrative. And in most cases, I suppose, up to this point, narrative has been the main focus of literary criticism, while the world that a novel constructs tends to be examined via the rather limited concepts of setting, so place and time. But think about that. Think about place and time, how complex and how rich those two simple terms are. And we use them all the time. We use them in our everyday life. But if we pause for a moment and consider these ideas a bit further. So if I actually change place and time to space and time, then we get resonances of Einstein's space-time, which gave rise to Bakhtin's concept of the chronotope, which was very much influenced by contemporary scientific thought. So this idea of unity of space and time in a narrative. And of course, the vast multi-layered, fluid or slippery sense of space and time that we get in fantasy literature. So going back to childhood paracosms, those worlds are often very much centered around space and time. So the where we are physically can be the child's bedroom or the garden or the schoolyard. But at the same where imaginatively can be a version of our world where the child is a god, or a different planet, or a weird, scary, mysterious, or enchanted somewhere else, far away or out of sight. And the same goes with time. The mundane time, the time governed by clocks, teachers, and parents, can be at night after the lights are off, or at playtime in school, or at one of those lazy Sunday afternoons. But the imaginative time can be the past, or the future, or the indeterminate fairy tale once upon a time. And what is certain, and for many grown-ups, for many of us who have moved too far away from our childhood selves, rather surprising, is that the child is keenly aware of that distinction. So during play, the muddy patch on the side of the lawn is a desert, or a pool of sentient sludge, or a volcanic landscape. Now, the moment the bell rings, or the parent says, get up now, it's lunchtime, it is the muddy patch again, the traces of which have to be washed off from hands and occasionally from faces. The child navigates these alternative perceptions of space and time quite easily, and that's what we also do when we read fiction. So what I suggest here is that one of the most fundamental things that fantasy literature specifically does when presenting us with imaginary worlds or reconfigurations of our own world is to challenge, to question, to redefine, to understand, to grapple, and eventually to come to terms with concepts of space and time. It doesn't only allow the writer and the reader to continue that childhood play of moving from one world to the other by opening a book. In many ways, all fiction does that. But fantasy literature distorts space and time in ways that are impossible. It can build a coherent and fully realized alternative world with its own chronology and geography, or a version of our world in which supernatural forces erupt and challenge every sense of here and now we think we have, or it can construct a doorway to an other world or an other dimension with a different concept of time, or offer us a hidden, invisible world somewhere around us with its own historical traditions and spaces which we cannot access. So this is the stuff of childhood paracosms writ large. It is play, yes, and there's nothing wrong with play, but it's serious play with serious stuff. And I don't think it can get much more serious than space and time, you know, concepts that really govern our perception of the world. So how can fantasy literature stretch our perceptions of space and time? Well, let me count the ways. And I'm starting with J.R.R. Tolkien, the author I've worked most on. He has been claimed actually to be the founding father of modern fantasy, and The Lord of the Rings has been claimed to be the founding narrative of modern fantasy, the mental template we share for defining fantasy as a genre. So in Tolkien, the moment we open the book, we seem to be in a mythical or in an approximation of a medieval space and time. So Middle-earth is a pre-industrial world, a world of kings and warriors. It's still forested at a pre-modern level. But once we start sort of zooming in, as it were, and noticing details in the vastness of what seems to be a coherent world, we find anachronisms and we find sort of historical accidents. Though Rohan, and these are the image up there at the top is the Meduseld there. Rohan seems to be a simulacrum of Old English culture. We have the architecture of Meduseld, which seems to be Old English. The names are Old English, the place names. We have these scenes there that take place that seem to come straight out of Beowulf. There seems to be a coherence in that sense at least. But when we get to the Shire is not medieval at all. It is more or less a Warwickshire village of about the period of the Diamond Jubilee, so sort of late 19th century really, complete with pocket watches, umbrellas, and fireworks. And while Tolkien compared Gondar, that's there on the left, with ancient Egypt, or with Rome, or with Byzantium, on the borders of Mordor, we get the glimpse of the Somme, and this is the Ted Nasmith's representation there, and the rotting bodies of elves and men and orcs, friends and enemies molded together in a grim reminiscence of Tolkien's traumatic experience in the First World War. So this palimpsest, this sort of multi-layered structure of chronotopes, from Anglo-Saxon heroic culture to an Egyptian or Byzantine or Roman mashup, to the Victorian pastoral, all the way to the battlefields of the First World War, are weaved together in a tapestry that feels coherent. It's only when we turn it around and you see the knot, so to speak, you start getting the sense of disparate elements sort of sticking out. But each chronotope references, the reference that each chronotope makes to a historical space and time brings along residues of associations that enrich and complicate the fantasy that Tolkien offers us. The Hobbit's insularism and little Englishness chimes with a Victorian English village chronotope. The noble savage freshness and virility we see in the Dark Age Rohirrim contrasts with the decadent atmosphere of civilization, which has reached its peak and is now in decline, already felt with the Egyptian and Byzantine resonances in Gondar. So this sort of fantasy that plays with time and space by hybridizing historical cultures to create a complex mosaic of geopolitical concerns is also evident actually in one of the followers of Tolkien, George R.R. Martin, in A Song of Ice and Fire in the series, in which we have at various points chronotopes that allude to the War of the Roses, medieval Spain, Viking raiders, and the lives of nomadic people of the Eurasian steppes. And it is not accidental, actually, that Tolkien claimed that his invented world, Middle-earth, itself only a part of a much bigger construction called Arda, is his version of Europe in some mythical proto-prehistory. So here's another challenge to how we perceive space and time. The imaginary world in Tolkien's sort of claim is not wholly other, it's not wholly alternative or invented, it is an echo, or perhaps it is a draft of the world most fantasy readers recognize. So think about how that stretches the way we perceive space and time, specifically our relations with and our perceptions of the past. So for Tolkien, this connection of his imaginary world with the land that he loved and lived was fundamental for his creative project right from the start. When he began writing the stories of the elves, complete with a cosmogony and stories of the gods and heroes, long before actually The Lord of the Rings was ever conceived, the world he was writing about was not Middle-earth at all. It was actually a version of England. So Tolkien's original impetus to create a world was a nationalistic project in many ways. He felt compelled to restore to the English a mythology of their own, following similar projects of rediscovering or actually inventing national mythologies in Germany, in Denmark, in Finland, alongside and in antagonism with the earlier Celtic revival that had happened in Britain. And this concern with the national, the cultural, the mythological past, it seems to me, is a particular interest of at least one strand of fantasy and fantastic writing. And I've got some more sort of contemporary examples really here. Good examples of this concern are the successful children's and young adult fantasies that flourished in the British Isles in the generation that actually followed Tolkien and his friend C.S. Lewis. So Susan Cooper, Alan Garner, Pat O'Shea, and many other children fantasists did not invent entire worlds. They did not invent alternative worlds. They set their stories in Cornwall, or in Buckinghamshire, or Cheshire, or North Wales, or Galway in Ireland. So these were real landscapes of the British Isles in contemporary times. But what happens in these books is that we have intrusions or even eruptions of the mythological past into the modern world. In The Hounds of the Morrigan, the first book there by Pat O'Shea, rural Galway in Ireland is literally invaded by the medieval Irish goddess of strife and destruction. And the child protagonists enter an otherworldly version of Ireland, still recognizable by landmarks on the landscape, but also clearly othered and enchanted, in order to save their own intruded world from annihilation. In The Owl Service by Alan Garner, a cursed love triangle from the Welsh Mabinogion tales is involuntarily reenacted by three teenagers and seem to affect literally the physical world around them. And in Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising sequence, King Arthur returns from the Romano-Celtic past in order to continue a perennial fight between good and evil, a narrative focus which Susan Cooper very much associated with her childhood memories of World War II. So such fantasies begin as realistic fiction and invite us to reconceptualize the world around us, allowing it to be disrupted and sometimes healed by the past. So past and present stop being distinct. They start to bleed into each other, really. Now, we had a little mention of Harry Potter in the previous talk, so I'll come back to that for a second. The case of the Harry Potter books is in some ways similar, but also very much distinct. The world in which Harry operates is our world, though revised to accommodate an alternative history that dovetails into or even sometimes explains ours. Take, for example, the historical witch hunts and witch trials in Britain and Europe in the late Middle Ages and early modern times. J.K. Rowling incorporates them into her magical history of the wizarding world and explains that us, Muggles, have got the wrong end of the stick about them. So there's an explanation that sort of ties in with our historical perception. At the same time, the entire trajectory of the 7 Harry Potter books is really an attempt to retell the story of the Holocaust. So from social Darwinism, the eugenics, the rise of Nazi Germany, to the persecution of mudbloods and the pursuit of a pure magical race who adopts the motto, magic is might, the parallels are deliberate and unmistakable. I have often actually taught the Harry Potter books in children's literature courses, immediately following books for children that deal with racism and segregation in a realistic historical context. So the book I often teach sort of in parallel is Mildred Taylor's Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. Now this book, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, is a realistic book. It's set in Mississippi in the 1930s. It's a brilliant, brilliant text. So one claim is that for difficult themes, such as racism, which many children actually still very much face today, it could be argued that tackling the issue through context set within historical novels can be in some way more beneficial than if you offer them something that has a contemporary fiction sort of setting. It can, research suggests, be easier to talk about past horrors and to give hope by offering a contrast with, hopefully, or most of the time, improved situation today, rather than focus on the now and the child's immediate experience. It can be done, but it's much, much harder. Well, doesn't fantasy literature do the same thing in many ways? Instead of taking us to the elsewhere of the past, it takes us to the elsewhere of an invented world. In many ways, both realistic depictions of historical racial prejudice, such as Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and fantastical reimaginings of historical racial prejudice, such as the Harry Potter books, create what has been called safe spaces for children, I would think adults as well in many cases, to explore and to question assumptions and ideological stances. The social commitment of this strand of fantasy is expressed via distorting perceptions of historical time. The Harry Potter books fulfill the function of mythologizing current anxieties and concerns, and that idea of mythologizing I'll come back to in a minute. So fantasy often deals with the immediate historical past, but as we saw earlier, also with the ideas of heritage and the national and cultural past. We could think of fantasy as a post-romantic phenomenon, a mode of the fantastic that deals with local mythological traditions, the echoes of the past in the landscape. But there is also fantasy that moves beyond the national and that moves beyond the regional. And my examples here then go to authors that I know we will be exploring further in this conference. So turning perhaps to the most acclaimed author of American fantasy in the 20th century and a creator of a world to rival Tolkien's, we find a different challenge to space and time. And I'm talking, of course, about Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea series. Le Guin made a conscious pivot away from the white European model, and she set Earthsea in a non-white world. The majority of characters in her archipelago of islands are deliberately copper brown in complexion. At the same time, Le Guin evokes a more distant past, a past of tribal communities who share similar shamanic practices and rituals. In some ways, her fantasy is an effort to capture an unrecorded past, a past before the mythological traditions that rely on the written text, a past that we can only glimpse through anthropology. And I think that the past she's evoking is meant to be a universal past, or what could be a universal past. What was there before Egypt, and before ancient Greece, and before Rome, and before medieval Europe? What was there in other places of the world where we don't get written mythological texts until much, much later, but where there must have been a rich oral tradition, beliefs, folk narratives and rituals? What were those first human tribes and social groups thinking or imagining or dreaming? That seems to be the context here, or the effort to imagine. And this same impulse goes back to the universal, and it's also evident in Neil Gaiman's acclaimed novel American Gods, which is based on the premise of old gods and traditions moving and changing and adapting in space, well, America in that particular case, and in time. Now, there's an array of gods and goddesses parading in American gods. We've got Egyptian, Norse, Baltic, Celtic gods and divinities. But we also get a glimpse of imagined forgotten gods lost in the midst of pre-textual time. The tale, and this is the image at the bottom here, this is how it was done in the recent adaptation of American Gods. The tale of the priestess Atsula and the mammoth-headed god Nyonanini is a story set in 14,000 BCE, following a group of nomadic people from a Siberian tribe. Now, those invented people with invented names, you go that far in the past where you have to imagine it wholly, reenact a story that Gaiman follows repeatedly throughout the novel, interweaved with actual named gods and recorded historical cultures. As each of them comes to America, they adapt, they change beyond recognition, or they become altogether forgotten. So just like Le Guin's invented tribal societies, which can be read as an evocation of a universal primeval past, Gaiman's Siberian tribe seems to be an attempt to go back to space and time of which we know nothing, nothing sort of objectively, but which we can only imagine and construct as an other version of ourselves. So I've talked about chronotopes so far, chronotopes in fantasy literature that make us reconsider and reevaluate our relationship with space and time. So how do we grapple with fantasy's creative use and often amalgamation of mythological traditions, of historical cultures, of the evocation of a national or a universal past? But place and time works in other ways too. There is a personal sense of time that definitely feels linear, and at least that's how most of us experience it. We live our lives around calendars, around clocks. I'm looking at the clock now thinking, how much time do I have? We count birthdays, we count anniversaries, we remember things by meaningful dates, all of that stuff. And I suppose where I'm heading is the end of all of this. I'm heading towards the concept of death, the finiteness of time that many of us are keenly aware of. We plan our lives around achieving our dreams, in the time we have, or we compile bucket lists of what I want to do before I die, that sort of thing. And that sense of finiteness of time, that sense of the inevitability of death, is something that actually, again, fantasy literature has come back to grapple with again and again and again. It seems to be a perennial theme. How do we live with the knowledge of death? How would we live if we didn't die? What if there's something out there after death? And what would be the cost of pursuing immortality against the natural order of things? Well, I'll start with Tolkien again, because he was very outspoken about the centrality of death as a theme in his writing, and in his self-reflecting, self-theorizing essay on fairy stories, he actually offers as one of the functions of fantasy the idea of escape. He claims that fantasy authors and readers, what they do when they read or they write fantasies, they escape from trite, mundane, or unimaginative reality, but also, importantly, escaping from the constraints of reality that reality imposes on us. So for Tolkien, fantasy is a vehicle for breaking the constraints of reality. And he offers a number of different examples, a number of different desires that fantasy fulfills. So the desire to converse with other living creatures, like with animals, or the desire to fly, like a bird. And I can get you to give me examples of fantasies that do that, and there's lots. But the oldest and the deepest desire, Tolkien says, is the great escape, the escape from death. Tolkien went so far as to say that The Lord of the Rings is about death and the desire for deathlessness. That's from his letters. So death versus immortality, or perhaps more accurately, a definitive end to life versus serial longevity, is one of the central binaries of Middle-earth. Men are, as the One Ring verse brutally declares, doomed to die. The elves, on the other hand, do not partake in that doom. They can be killed by violence, but they have the ability to return. Their souls and bodies are bound to the created world itself, so as long as the world exists, they exist. What happens to men when they die in Tolkien's mythology is a mystery. Nobody really knows. Just like in our real world, there are educated guesses, but no one has come back to tell the tale. And Tolkien explored the implications of this premise in love stories between elves and men, bringing people with two different sort of life expectations and spans. So the story of there's nothing in many ways new here. The story of an elvish maiden in love with a mortal man is at the heart of one of the key stories of Tolkien's extended mythology, the tale of Beren and Luthien. But the motif itself is not new. The idea of the fairy woman and the mortal man, the latter seduced and doomed often to lunacy or melancholy or death, is actually an international folklore motif and common in many Northern European traditions. But in Tolkien's hands, it becomes a vehicle to explore this question, the question of death and immortality. So, like an inversion of the Orpheus story, Luthien brings Beren back from death. But in doing so, she has to forgo her own immortality to be with him. And that same dilemma is reenacted thousands of years and many generations later by Aragorn and Arwen, descendants of Beren and Luthien. And Arwen faces the same sort of ruthless choice. And in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, we have this moment of Aragorn's death and Arwen's subsequent aimless existence, contemplating her own demise, which is a very curious mix of melancholy and despair. Despair is usually something that Tolkien's very critical of, but this is the point where he allows it to surface. Now, this is the stuff of myth. This is the sort of fundamental human questions that myth, in its religious or spiritual guise, has attempted to answer through the centuries. So in many ways, the tale of Beren and Luthien and the tale of Aragorn and Arwen are comparable to stories such as the one of Eos and Tithonus. Again, to remind you the story, that's in the Homeric hymns. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it. So Eos is the goddess of the dawn who wished for her mortal lover, Tithonus, to become immortal. He was granted that gift from Zeus, but Eos forgot to also ask for eternal youth for him too. So Tithonus is condemned to be forever aging, but never will he die. In some later retellings, he becomes a cricket or a cicada, singing eternally, begging for death. In Tolkien's world, we've got something sort of similar. The elves grow weary of the world. They're tied to the world. They cannot escape the world. And they see they see men's escape through death as a gift. They see that as something actually positive. Perhaps, this escape to an unknown, but perhaps more interesting other place through death is more important. So time and space means something very different to elves and men in that context. But this desire for deathlessness is also an important part of how fantasy deals with time. And what, again, the question I asked before, if we could find a way to avoid death, and what would be the price of non-finite time? And again, there's multiple examples, and I only have time to pick a couple. Again, in Le Guin's Earthsea stories, one wizard's pursuit of immortality actually threatens the world itself. At the beginning of The Farthest Shore, which is the final book of the first trilogy, we encounter the world of Earthsea in a state of thinning. Magic is seeping out of the world. People and animals are sickening. Something is very wrong. And the main protagonist, Ged, whose life we have followed throughout the entire trilogy, and now he's, an older man, the archmage of Earthsea, travels with the young Prince Aran to the dry land, the land of the dead. So we now get a space where the dead live, a place. Here, Ged and Aran find a deranged wizard who has managed to bridge the divide between the world of the living and the land of the dead so as to guarantee his own immortality, or more accurately, serial longevity. However, this comes at a great cost to the protagonist, who now exists in a pitiful state in between life and death. But this condition of being half dead and half alive takes on a greater significance when one understands that, in contrast to Tolkien, who operates in a Judeo-Christian worldview, of which there is a sense of something beyond death in a linear fashion. But in Le Guin's trilogy, which operates in an Eastern Taoist perspective, death is but one aspect of a circular rite of passage, rather than the end game with a more simple linear structure. So accordingly, when Ged refers to the long-dead legendary king of Earthsea, Ereth Akber, he explains that the part of the king that survives is not just his name or his reputation, not his shadow in the land of the dead, but rather out there in the world of the living, albeit in a different form. And I'm quoting, He's the earth and sunlight, the leaves of trees, the eagle's flight. He's alive, and all who ever died live. They are reborn and have no end, nor will there ever be an end. So this sort of entrapment in this sort of in-between, serial longevity in between life and death is actually a curse. Now, importantly, Philip Pullman explores death in his Dark Materials trilogy in a very similar manner, but this time not from a religious point of view, but from a humanist point of view. When Lyra descends to the land of the dead to free the ghostly remains from an existence of perpetual remorse and torment, she promises them a version of an afterlife that chimes with Le Guin's, but uses a much more materialistic version of the universe. And that is Lyra now talking to the dead ghosts. That is what will happen, Lyra said. And it's true, perfectly true. When you go out of here, all the particles that make you up will loosen, will float apart, just like your demons did. If you've seen people dying, you know what that looks like. But your demons ain't just nothing now. They are part of everything. All the atoms that were them, they've gone into the air and the wind and the trees and the earth and all the living things. They'll never vanish. They're just part of everything. And that's exactly what will happen to you. I swear to you, I promise on my honor. You'll drift apart, it's true, but you'll be out in the open, part of everything alive again. So in Le Guin and Pullman, death is not just bound to time, the notion of a cut-off point of a person's timeline and what might come after, but also to space. In both texts, we get a land of the dead, a particular place where the dead live, or actually where they're trapped, and from where they have to be freed, they have to escape. And this is a very different version of Tolkien's notion of escape. This is not escaping from death into deathlessness, but escaping the view of an afterlife prevalent in the classical and Judeo-Christian tradition into another spiritual or philosophical alternative. So fantasy, I think, comes very close to the function of myth when dealing with death and immortality and other big existential questions. Not by attempting to establish religious dogma or offer a scientific explanation, but through telling an imaginative story. In many different cultures around the world, myth has served as a creative but also economical way of thinking about the world and fundamental questions of human existence. Mary Beard, the Cambridge classicist, in a concise and lucid discussion of the function of myth, has suggested that we should be thinking of myth as a verb, to myth, as a process that allows different societies to express their worldviews, their beliefs, their fears, their anxieties by telling a story. The same can be claimed about the way in which fantasy deals with national, cultural, or universal pasts and landscapes. It hybridizes them, it mythologizes them. Lawrence Koop, drawing on the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, has examined myth as a vehicle to explore and understand reality by a symbolic, metaphorical way of thinking. Fantasy seems to be doing something very similar. By stretching, by distorting, by expanding space and time, understood as either collective or personal concepts, fantasy harnesses creativity to make us think of new, alternative, fresh ways about these things. In many ways, it brings us back to those moments I started with, those childhood moments of play, the sort of activity that helped our younger selves develop. As the late and much missed Terry Pratchett once reportedly said, fantasy is an exercise bicycle for the mind. It might not take you anywhere, but it tones up the muscles that can. Thank you.